Well, good morning and welcome to the March 27th session of the Virginia Opioid Abatement Authority's Abatement Academy. If this is your first time joining us, the Abatement Academy is a series of free online webinars that are hosted by the authority. It provides examples of best practices and strategies for community-level opioid abatement remediation efforts that can be supported with opioid settlement funds. The presenters and speakers featured on the Abatement Academy are experts, practitioners, and supporters of community-based opioid abatement efforts. They join us as volunteers to share their story. They receive no compensation from the OAA. The whole concept of our Abatement Academy would not be possible if it wasn't for these speakers generously sharing their time and expertise. Now, today's episode is a real treat for me in particular because our featured speaker is a longtime colleague and friend. And I think many of those of you in attendance already know Gretchen Brown, but I still have the honor to formally introduce her. So everyone, Gretchen Brown, after receiving her master's degree in social work from Virginia Commonwealth University, Gretchen was a Child Protective Services investigator for 8 years in Prince William County and in Henrico counties. In Henrico, she currently is the Director of Social Services after having served as the Assistant Director over the Services Programs, the Division Manager for Child Welfare Programs, and CPS Supervisor for 16 years. Gretchen has served for more than 25 years on local and state committees devoted to policy and legislation, best practice initiatives, trauma-informed care, and interagency collaboration. Her current passion is to find innovative and creative ways to engage all facets of the community in efforts to prevent child welfare system involvement and to support children and families in achieving safety, permanency, and well-being as they exit the child welfare system. So I'm getting ready to turn it over to Gretchen for her presentation. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to type them into the chat or into the Q&A. Either one is fine. As I'll be acting as the moderator, so I'll ask the questions for you, and we can either handle them during the presentation, if that's okay with Gretchen, or feel free to hold your questions towards the end if you'd like to do that. So with that as an introduction, it's a pleasure to turn the floor over to Gretchen.
Hey, everybody. So most of you who know me know I'm a pretty interactive person, so it's so weird not to see everybody while I'm talking. Tony, I'm super okay with you interrupting me at any point with any questions that anybody has. That's preferential, I guess, because you would like to try to capture the moment instead of trying to forget what we were talking about and having trouble moving on. So I'll go ahead and get started. I did a really brief agenda, although you guys know that I have trouble staying on topic, so I'm going to try to follow slides. But I think the best way for me to do this presentation is to talk about how I made the path to getting OAA funding, and so hopefully it'll make it easier for folks considering that. You won't have to go through sort of the painful existence that we've been in for the past few years, trying to navigate how to make sense of this new space that we've been in. So how we sort of discovered the need for a kinship navigation position, sort of isolating the specific need for the kinship navigator. So not only did we have a problem adequately supporting our kinship families across the continuum of child welfare, but sort of then how did we identify what the resource was that we needed? When the OAA came up as a possible funding stream, doing the research that was necessary to connect the dots and then actually making the request. And so I'm hoping to talk through all of those things today. So it really starts with how kinship care evolved in our locality. So I was relatively new to all of child welfare in 2019. I had been supervising just Child Protective Services, then became a division manager, and foster care is something, I put people into and I talked about when I sat on FAPT, but I hadn't really lived that existence. And so a couple of years in, the moment in time, we actually had a very specific moment in time when we intentionally started doing kinship care. We had very rarely been approving relatives as foster parents. I can remember one specific situation where we had a grandparent of a paternal grandmother of a medically fragile child who also happened to be a NICU nurse. And so it made a lot of sense for her to care for her grandchild. Well, as we moved through the foster care case, the interesting thing was that it turns out that her son was not the biological father of the child. She continued to provide care for that child until the child succumbed to their medical issues. And she remained a foster parent of ours for other foster children after that, which was kind of cool. But it was those one-off situations that we were actually using a relative as a foster parent. But we were regularly safety planning kids out of their a home of origin with relatives. We just weren't calling it kinship care. We were just calling it safety planning. And sometimes it would last a long time, and we would keep cases open to CPS ongoing services for a long time, trying to support those families, sort of what the PCSPP is supposed to be doing now. And then in 2019, specifically August of 2019, we had hired a new resource family coordinator who came to us from an agency that was regularly doing kinship care, kinship foster care specifically. And she really began to challenge our thinking and our practice on this, and what had really become these myths or sort of cultural beliefs that around kinship foster care specifically. And some of those included like the adage that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. So why would we think that Aunt Gretchen is not also using drugs or doing these awful things to children if she's related to mom? How did Aunt Gretchen not know what was going on to intervene? Because, that's Aunt Gretchen's responsibility. That Gretchen had these kids before and didn't do anything and gave them back to the parents. So we can't trust Gretchen. Or if I'm a grandparent, a grandma didn't protect these kids and she raised these parents who became these problem parents. And so why would we expect her to be any different with her grandchildren? And sometimes it's because they've all lived in the same household at some point in time. I remember a former director of ours believing that if we paid family members to take care of kids they should feel obligated to care for, they'll become dependent on the money and never want to just receive custody of their grandkids or relative kids. And I remember thinking to myself when I was like, gosh, I guess maybe that's a possibility, but why would they want us to be involved in their lives until these kids turn 18? I mean, most people really don't want to deal with us at all, even when we come with a check. But anyway, so it was a perfect opportunity. I mean, I was sort of green in the space and open to doing things differently. And so we started having the conversation. So next slide, Tony. Some of the things that we knew going into this and in the early days of doing formal kinship care is that there are some unique challenges in the kinship caregiver space. So there were additional case dynamics that come when you involve relatives, both formally and informally in this process, more than just adding an additional household to the caseload, right? So I always talk about foster care cases being three separate cases. You've got the sort of the child in their placement. You've got the birth family that you're trying to reunify with. You've got your concurrent goal sometimes being a third set of people that you're working with. And uniquely, the kinship caregiver is sort of their own special part of the case that deserves a lot of attention that we're not always giving it. With kinship foster care specifically, we knew one of the overarching challenges was the inability to be prepared to become a foster parent. So, we use the examples of midnight on a Friday in an on-call situation. You're calling grandparent out of the blue saying, can you not only take care of your grandchild, but can you become their foster parent? And all of the things that entails, from meeting basic needs to having to interact with the department and the court and a GAL and support visitation and all of those things. So there was that big umbrella, and it trickled down to some of the unique challenges that are on this slide. We talked about assumptions and myths, navigating complicated family history and family relationships. So while that can also be a strength in kinship, it can be a huge challenge, not only because there is a strained relationship already, or people are worried about becoming the outcast in their family system when they step into this role, which is perceived as being, by some, is perceived as being sort of anti-parent. The foster home approval process is cumbersome. We've done a lot to try to navigate making that a simpler, family-driven process and doing things in the home, the traditions of care in the home with families. But the approval process is a lot harder than it was just a safety plan with folks. Kin-specific services and supports, I think, really drilling down into the unique needs of that family system and making sure that we're supporting them in that way beyond just the traditional kinship support group or the foster parent support group or the systems that we have in place to support foster parents with ongoing training and education, things like that. The lack of information that people have and the fear of system involvement that you have to work to overcome when you're working with kinship families. You sort of feel like a salesman when you're pitching this as a good thing to folks. Folks often have either unstable housing or inadequate housing to meet the needs of the kids that we're asking them to take care of. So lots of people are on a limited lease. So their lease agreement might allow for a certain number of people or only have a certain number of bedrooms. So we're also navigating some of that and just some of the basic needs that they have for beds and a car big enough to fit everybody. Lack of legal services. So when you think about the legal representation that exists in foster care, these folks are the only people that are not represented legally in the system. And so making sure that their voice is heard and there's advocacy for what their needs are throughout the legal part of the process. What we have also found is that the judicial system can be very stuck in that myth and mindset that we were in 2000, coming into 2019. And sometimes they've got experience with these family systems that lead them to have some legitimate reasons to be skeptical about family involvement. And then the mental and physical health of the child and the caregiver. We're sometimes coming across grandparents who have some medical issues. And so we're constantly navigating that or the health needs of a child. We might have a physically challenged child that needs some structural changes to a home or a vehicle big enough to fit a wheelchair. Things like that we're coming across. And again, if you're a foster parent who has had we think about, we talk to our foster parents in training about how long or when they decided, and they talk about at least 12 months or longer that they take thinking about and planning to become a foster parent before they come to an orientation session or a training session. And these kinship caregivers have like zero time to prepare. So you think about the fact that their job doesn't know and isn't ready to support them. They haven't prepared a bedroom for a child. They're in their natural support systems, like their church group or their friend group, don't know that they're getting ready to take this on. And those folks may have their own feelings or perceptions about what foster care is. So these are some of the challenges that we either knew coming into the kinship space or began to experience in the kinship space in the very early days. But we also knew there were a lot of strengths to this. And again, a lot of that's based on the fact that we had been doing informal kinship care for years and years and years through that safety planning process. So we know that, I'm sorry, I gotta move to my note screen, sorry. So we knew that it's less traumatic for a child in the middle of the night who's leaving a situation they don't want to leave to go to someone they know versus a stranger. So, I mean, they're really obvious of the reduced trauma of separating from their parents. Children placed with relatives experience fewer placement disruptions most of the time. I will say that anecdotally, that's not the experience we always have with teenagers who are entering care with a lot of behavioral challenges and legal system involvement, maybe some school disruption issues. So those we have seen a little bit of more placement disruption than some of our elementary and middle school age children who maybe just haven't gotten there yet. But again, we see fewer placement changes. Children placed with relatives and kin are sometimes or more likely to stay in their school systems or at least near their community of origin, or close enough that there is an intentional connection to friends and support systems that they had when they entered foster care or the kinship arrangement. In a lot of situations, relatives and fictive kin can facilitate natural family opportunities for connection. So while that might not be with the birth family, it might be that they're spending the holidays with extended family. Well, those are the extended family members of the children. So it's not always a rosy relationship with the parent, but it is that connection to extended family that can happen. And I think sometimes we forget about those opportunities. And then kinship caregivers are more likely to accept some of the challenging behaviors and some of the dynamics that make it more difficult to find placements for children, particularly home-based placements for children. And they keep sibling groups together in a lot of situations. That's not always the case. Some of that depends on the dynamic that children enter foster care with. So you're bringing a sibling group into care, and one of them has been sexually offending against the younger siblings. Obviously, those kids are likely going to be separated. And so we have seen some separation, but we've also seen some ability that while a child can't be immediately placed with their sibling group in a kinship home, that we've been able to move in that direction quicker once the treatment and services and stability exist for that child. So they're more open to that idea. So if we go back to the progression from 2019 to the present, we have been doing formal kinship care. And then in 2022, 23-ish, we really intentionally started talking about kinship care from the very first point of contact that we were having as an agency. So we have a trauma-informed leadership team that's been in place for about 9 or 10 years now, and they took on the task of saying, where are all of the opportunities to either identify kin, engage kin differently, explore them as support systems, not always just placement, differently. And so we drilled down into our child welfare continuum and started with our hotline and went as specifically as saying, every time you take a hotline call on the CPS hotline, ask about emergency contacts, or is the caller aware of any support or family members, and documenting that in OASIS in the narrative screen. And then as that referral has moved through the system, making sure that every initial interview with a child or family member is identifying 1 or 2 natural supports for that person or that family system. And we went as specific as saying, you go to the collateral information screen, this is how you document that contact. And just making sure that we're beginning to develop the stream of folks or the list of folks that might become kinship opportunities in the future. So we began talking about family differently in our all of our child welfare practice, and that I think really helped us make a culture shift into how we considered kinship. So we started doing that really intentionally, and really engaging, particularly CPS was a difficult place to penetrate, because, they're seeing sometimes the very worst things that happen to kids and are not wanting to risk that happening to a kid again. And so really teaching them to trust family differently was part of that culture change in our child welfare continuum. Um, Between like 2020 and now, we have relied super heavily on our faith community and our faith partnerships to take care of kinship families. So we would identify sort of anecdotally, hey, we have a kinship caregiver who really needs help with transportation or could use meals for a week or two while they're trying to navigate taking in a sibling group of 4 in that case. They need clothes. They need help transporting kids to a medical appointment. And our faith community really stepped up, and we had been using them for supporting our traditional foster homes. And so it felt natural to talk to them about the kinship space. And they were finding new church communities to engage that were in communities where kinship family members lived. And so we were doing that. And we started in 2023 building some capacity by way of conversation in our community. So we started talking to other folks about what kinship care looks like. We now have an organization that's running a grandparents raising grandchildren support group in our community that's fairly well attended. We started connecting with agencies that we knew were doing extensive family finding efforts. We started talking to a treatment foster care organization about what that additional support service looks like in a treatment foster home, and how could we replicate that sort of supplemental service in a kinship situation around a very specific need of that family. And so we started expanding that conversation out into the community, thinking, actually becoming very overwhelmed with managing this by ourselves. We weren't getting new positions or any of that. And then in steps in 2023, a presentation from the Opioid Abatement Authority, next screen, Tony, around ways that local social services could be using Opioid Abatement Authority money. And I think that in that presentation, I was trying to figure out, like, what's the opportunity for social services? We're not substance abuse treatment providers. It's not an area of expertise for us, even though we're navigating that space all day, every day with our clients. But I knew that I knew that we had a need that couldn't be met. And I also knew that most of the families that we're talking about were dealing with substance use issues, either as a primary problem or a secondary, tertiary issue. And so I was starting to think about how I could connect the dots on that. And I wanted money to get a position. So in January of 2024, I started thinking about that connection more specifically. And so this is well over a year ago, sort of what a dynamic was. And first I went in to look at how many kinship situations, either in foster care or diversion, were a result of substance use disorder issues. So at that time, man, I miss these days where we just had 146 kids in care. But we had 146 youth in foster care. 70% of them had parents or prior custodians with substance use disorder. And so then I started looking at those 102 youth to say, where were they placed? So I already had 35 kids who had experienced substance use disorder, who were living in a kinship home, that I knew that kinship home likely needed some additional support, that my case managers, because of our growing caseloads, were not going to be able to adequately assess and treat and meet those needs. So then I looked at kinship care, that diversion. We were not calling it PCSPP at the time. And we had 114 families in January of 2024 that we were serving in family preservation. We're at about 130 now. And 33% of those families had a primary issue identified as substance use disorder. It's a little bit trickier to get that information because the underlying abuse or neglect that opened that case, or the court action like a Chin's petition or a delinquency, didn't identify that as the primary reason that case was being opened. So we sort of had to drill down. It could be more or less than 33%, or excuse me, just more than 33%. But that's where we sort of said this is one of the primary dynamics in that household. And 22 of those families had children that were in a kinship diversion situation, so safety planned out of their home as a result of substance use disorder as a primary issue. 13 families, 13 families with children placed away from their primary caregivers had substance usage disorder. We had 22 diversion situations. 13 of those families were the SUD families. So we had a pretty decent number of kids and families that we were ready to talk about. And then I knew and went and found this data that's a little bit outdated, that every kid who's in foster care living with a relative, there are 19 children being raised by grandparents or other relatives outside of the foster care system. So the folks we don't even know about. I feel like we sometimes know about these families because we're receiving those kids either in our diversion or our prevention services or in foster care because of a placement disruption. So a lot of the kids that we're seeing enter foster care through delinquency and Chin's petitions are kids who have already lived with 2 or 3 or even 4 other relatives before coming into care. And so we knew that. I was really surprised to see the number or the statistic this high. So I knew I needed to go in search of data in order to get a position. And I will say that one of the things that I had been doing sort of jokingly is for a couple of years in our League Child and Family Services meeting, I had been saying to M. Parente specifically, hey, if you ever look at needing to pilot a kinship case manager, we'll be the host site. We'll take that, because we were seeing an increase in our kinship numbers, pretty significant increase. We're at like 42%, between 42 and 46% of our kids that are under the age of 18 are placed in kinship homes. And really just the support role that was needed for those cases was just becoming overwhelming. So I knew I needed a position, or I needed some extra help. And turns out I wasn't going to get it from the state. But I knew that Tony and his crew were going to want some data around my request, that what is the problem I'm trying to solve. So I approached this, and I'll tell you, in the wrong way in the beginning, is that I just felt like I needed to connect the dots between kinship care and substance use disorder, and like foster care and child welfare caseloads and substance use disorder. So most of my data in the beginning, you'll see, is just around proving the fact that there's a connection between child welfare and substance use disorder. So I went in search of that data, found it pretty quickly. 7.5 million children involved in child protective services intervention annually. In 2017, caregiver drug misuse was identified in 30.8% of child substantiated abuse or neglect cases. So that does not include unfounded abuse and neglect reports, and it does not include family assessments in a lot of the states where you're not required to make a substantiation in those kinds of interventions. So imagine how big that number really is. And you saw in Henrico sort of anecdotally what that looks like. And we know that those families in particular are receiving ongoing child welfare services. So then we looked at, I was like, so opioid abatement money is tied to national drug abuse data. So let's look at that. And you'll see in this chart, and I won't go over the numbers, but as of 2020, there were a substantial number of families where the children were removed because of the condition of parental alcohol and drug abuse. So it was 39% the cases where that was identified as a condition of the removal. For those of you who are in our child welfare database and are looking at that screen, I don't think we're capturing always that that's one of the reasons that children are entering foster care. So I think that 39% is probably a little bit low. But this line follows the trend data with opioid use and opioid overdose. It's really sort of the same trend that we saw. So then the next slide, I mean, I just continued to try to make the connections that the other big problem we have is with children who age out of foster care. So 23,000 kids age out of foster care without a permanent connection in the United States annually. We have been told repeatedly and seen the numbers that say Virginia has always ranked near the bottom of that and had a very poor data in that area. And we know, and I found this out through some research, that 1 in 2 youth who age out of foster care without a permanent placement or connection develop substance use disorder, which I thought was horrifying. But we know that they go to jail and they have criminal experiences and they're underemployed and they're unhoused. And now we know this alarming statistic about their substance use disorder. And then I started thinking about, wait a minute, there's another connection. We know that people have the ability to inherit substance use disorder. So we know that biological factors play a role in inheriting a substance use disorder. So I went in search of that data and found that genetics account for 40 to 60% of someone's risk for developing SUD, and that drug addiction is as much as 70% inheritable. And those two sites are noted there. So, and then I did find one piece of good data, so all hope is not lost, that in Virginia, we were seeing the data trend that foster care youth placed with kinship caregivers achieve permanency at a rate of 97%, and 0% actually age out of foster care. So this was super exciting to me. Made perfect sense about why someone should give me at least one position to manage the problem, because I've got all of this data that says there's this connection between substance use disorder and foster care and kinship, the need for kinship care. So if we fix foster care with kinship care, then there's a great connection to solving the substance use problem. So what I found was I spent days and weeks putting together this beautiful presentation. In Henrico County, we actually have a committee that hears all of the presentations for money, for Opioid Abatement Authority money. And so I had to make my first pitch there and made my pitch to that committee. They're all friendly faces in the room. Everybody gave me all this applause and patted me on the back and what a great presentation I had done. And we got some feedback from Tony and his group that you haven't really met all the elements of what the mission and the parameters of the OAA money sort of require and the conditions of the settlements. We needed to be able to say very specifically how we were going to resolve the issue of substance abuse or reduce the likelihood of substance use, and not just connect the dots between the problems that were being experienced. So we got very friendly feedback. We reframed the data and the experiences that we were having, and came up with our request. So we asked for a position. We asked for a senior family service specialist. In our locality, all of our child welfare positions are classified as senior level positions. We do underfill, but we set the standard that we want all of our positions to be operational as senior. So we broke down the cost of the position, In the initial proposal, we had failed to account for the 4.8% increase that we were going to receive. So we had to revise that because we were making our pitch this time of year, but had failed to include what we knew was going to be our increase come July 1. And we knew we were not going to get the award until after the July request. So we made that position request, and we came up with this lovely statement about what the position was going to do. And that's the next slide, Tony. So we have these lofty goals of identifying, connecting to, and using services to meet the needs of the kids that they're caring for. So we want to make sure that kinship caregivers, no matter who they are, we can help identify the services that they need, connect them, and also make sure they are using those services. And another big goal of ours is to promote partnerships. My gift when I retire to my agency is that I want to have developed or helped supported the development of the appropriate resources in our community, some of which might be social services, so that we can prevent children needing to come into the child welfare system to have their needs met. And you know, we just have to do this. So if we can develop and promote better support and access to services for kinship providers so that they don't have to lose custody of a kid to stabilize and best meet their needs, then I feel like that's the thing I can focus on. And I feel like this position can help do that. I specifically then started to drill down into what their duties would be, because you've got to write essential duties, and then you have to hire somebody, and then they need to know what you've hired them to do. The really easy part of this is the case management piece. So they are going to be, and she currently is, a second case manager on some kinship situations, both in the PCSPP, sorry, I cannot ever get those letters right. Both in the prevention kinship space and in the foster care space. So not every case, because we don't have that capacity, but in situations where there is really potentially this is a rocky situation, or we're not 100% convinced this is going to be super smooth or super natural, is being the person that helps to either do the permanency assessment or as an assessment of needs if the child's already been placed there, and then providing that extra layer of connection to support. She also does some parent education stuff and connects to resources, provides some of that education in the home. So there is that direct provision of services, and will be providing a kinship caregiver support group as part of her job duties. The other piece is that macro piece. So a part of her job, she will not be doing full-time case management. We really are trying to cap that caseload at about 6 to 8 families, is going to be this resource development and management. So helping community partners develop kin-focused services and supports. She is a member of our local addiction task force called Empower Henrico, and working with a prevention work group or committee there. So talking to not only the county players, but private agencies and nonprofits to look at how we can develop those resources, again, so that they're accessible outside of the child welfare system. We are going to be developing sort of an information and referral system to assist kinship caregivers. So it might start as an online resource before it becomes sort of a call center or a here's how you ask for help and we help navigate you to help. That maybe like a referral database and have other tools. But if you are experiencing this, here are service providers in our community who can help. Here's some literature that you can read. Here are some TED Talks or videos you can watch. And hopefully here's a support group that you might connect to so that you can begin to develop your own natural supports in this space. And then really working with other local departments of social services to develop sort of a regional approach to supporting kinship families. So the state is facilitating some of that conversation with us now through our Kin First pods that are happening in the regions throughout the state. And we're really hoping to do that and to be able to partner well with each other, because a family that comes to our attention in Henrico is likely not living in Henrico or may not be living in Henrico. And I might need to partner with another locality around what supports exist in their community. So really working collaboratively with those other localities. So you can imagine with money comes a reporting back of the data. So I think that anecdotally, we are going to know that we are successful when we feel like we are supporting and resourcing kinship caregivers better to maintain stable placements. I think to help reduce the number of kids entering foster care, particularly from the PCSPP program. And to increase the number of foster care youth placed in kinship homes. I think when we're better at supporting them, then that looks like a better option for the workers and then the families as well. One of the specific things I mentioned that we're going to be doing is running a support group that is very specific to kinship providers. Our kinship families are not coming to our foster parent support group that we run. And we have identified and are going to be doing a survey with them to figure out what they need from us in that space. But when we do that, we are going to be capturing specific data around substance use prevention. We're going to be offering some formal SUD prevention programming in that support group, and both to adults and the children who come to our support groups. And harm reduction kits and some really very specific prevention focused things. And those are some of the data elements that we'll be reporting back to the OAA annually as we have this funding coming in. I believe we'll also be successful, and how we'll measure success is looking at the decrease in foster care entries, because we're better supporting kids on the front end of services. Increasing the use of kinship placements, improving timeliness to permanency. We are seeing a really dramatic increase in the use of kin gap and transfer of custody to a relative after a family's inability to demonstrate that reunification is option. Interestingly, we are also seeing a huge increase in our reunification numbers. And I don't think that's just because we have really dedicated workers to that. I think some of it is because we're placing in kinship placements and there is a more natural mechanism for kids to stay connected to families and families to sort of hold each other accountable. And then another measure of success is when we have this resource, this online resource and database and INR system sort of ready to roll out. And so where we are today is that in July of 2024, we received the appropriation. Our funding is about 80%, or maybe exactly 80% from the state OAA funds. And Tony can answer questions about that much better than me. And then we have a 20% local match. So from our the OAA money that was distributed to our locality, we are matching a portion of what the OAA has given to us. We were able to hiring is a long process, our Kinship Navigator in November of 2024. She has taken a few months to sort of onboard and learn our agency. She was not from our community. And get to know our workers. She's been carrying that case management role and is really now starting to integrate into that macro space. So if you know anything about the OAA funding, there's like a cap on the number of years you can receive the funding. And so we have just submitted our application to continue the funds into the next year. I don't know if it's Tony might have to answer this, if it's a continuation or considered a new application, but we envision that we will need the funding this year and potentially next year before we do one of two things. We either request a local position to do this work because we've proven how effective and necessary it is in the community, and we need that data collection to really demonstrate that when I make a pitch to my county manager and my board of supervisors. or we are going to have reduced the caseload in foster care enough that I can use a vacant position and transition the kinship over into that vacancy. That's not a really great business move, but if we had to consider doing that, because I couldn't get it in a budget request, I think that's one of the things we can do. So again, we've just submitted that application. Hopefully me doing things like this with Tony will help be my sales pitch for continuing that funding for a little bit longer. But in all honesty, the timing, we just haven't been able to see a lot of the data that we're anticipating or the outcomes that we're anticipating come to fruition yet. So I think why this worked for us now is because we had been working on our agency culture around the kinship conversation. I think everybody's getting the opportunity to do that now, whether by choice or force, with the direction that the state has been really encouraging us to go. There has been legislation in this space, and budget amendments to support the kinship conversation. So we know KinGAP has been in place for a number of years now. There's also the relative maintenance payment that's available if you're involved in the PCSPP. So there's been some other supports that have made this more enticing to do. And we have community partners that are really wanting to get into this space. If you have a United Methodist Family Services in your community, they are one of the agencies that's super engaged. We just met with them again this year, just 2 days ago, to talk about how to further develop out kinship support services in their programming. So that's sort of the why now. We were also drowning. Our workers were just not prepared. We have 181 youth in foster care now. Might be a little bit lower because we sent some on trial home visit this week. But it just felt like the right time to try to build in that extra layer of support and help. And I am happy to thank you for your time and your interest, especially from the people who already get to hear from me all the time. But I'm happy to entertain any questions that anybody has.
While folks are thinking about questions, and again, just type your question in the chat. The funding from opioid settlements in Virginia is going to be about $1 billion over 18 years. And some of that money most of the money comes to the OAA, and we use it to make grants. But cities and counties, they each get, every time a settlement payment is made to Virginia, each city and each county gets some of that money directly. And so in the case of Henrico with this particular program, a portion of the program, the local match, is actually paid for with the opioid settlement funds that went directly to Henrico. And then the balance of it was with a grant from the OAA to Henrico County in the individual grant category. So there's a question in the chat from Randy Knights. It says, great info, Gretchen. Are you willing to share your PowerPoint? And I can actually answer that one because we share the PowerPoint and the recording of the presentation on the OAA website. And of course, Gretchen's free to send it to anybody that she chooses to as well.
And I think the other thing that I remember you talking about, Tony, was that you also can make application information available to folks. And you guys have been willing and really graciously provided us feedback during that process, so that we could be more successful. So don't be intimidated by that process because that information is publicly available to you. So I encourage you not to reinvent the wheel. The other thing, I see Beth, or sorry, I see Gil Crooks on here, and we've often talked about how some of our smaller localities don't have as much need or prevalence. The need might be there, but not by volume. You can also collaborate regionally with OAA funding. So there's a way that a number of smaller localities could come together to support an initiative. It happens in the other OAA funding conversations around CSBs coming together to do things. and local governments coming together to do things. So I would encourage folks not to walk away if you don't think you have a volume issue, because there is a way to do this from a regional perspective. And Tony might be able to speak to that a little bit differently. But I would encourage you, if you think you're going to have the need or kind of have it now, have the conversation now, because we were in over our heads before we got the help. And now we're trying to navigate how to best use this person, because we could use 10 of them, in all honesty. So it was a super easy process. I'm not saying the application is easy or any of that stuff, but it's not bad. And the benefit is just huge. I mean, who gets positions regularly? Nobody.
And so there's a little bit of complexity to the OAA grants, and that's because, there's a lot of eyes on how these funds are being used. And there's a lot of sort of legal issues, but that's the bad news. The good news is, for me and for my team here at the OAA office, all we do all day is help localities work this out. So if you have questions about how you'd like to try to move forward with an application to the OAA for a KinNav program or a similar program, please feel free to reach out to me or to anybody on my team, and we will guide you through the process. We normally take applications from cities and counties starting October 1st, and the closing period is April 1st. And we do that because, just like in your localities, we have a budget process that we have to go through. Our grants to cities and counties take effect on July 1st. So the deadline for the current round is next week. Might not be able to start from scratch today and get it in by next week, but if you're willing to give it a try, we're here to help you. There's a question about whether Gretchen applied for funds directly to the OAA, or did it come through the county? And I can let Gretchen speak to what happened in Henrico, but any application that we receive from a city or county has to be signed by the chief executive. So it can't be signed by the department head. It has to be signed by your city manager, your county administrator, whoever has signatory authority for your governing body, the governing body being a city council or board of supervisors.
So in our situation, we actually have we had an addiction task force that was sort of already in place before the funding came. The funding naturally fit in that work group, and they have a committee from that work group. And on that committee is one of our deputy county managers. And so they hear all the requests for funding. And in my case, really did the bulk or the heavy lifting for completing the application. I provided data and information, and they sort of assuaged that because they had been doing other applications and were familiar with the process. So we had a really organized effort. And so I didn't have to ask for the signature myself. The committee said yes, and everything else just sort of fell into place. It probably won't be quite as easy in localities that are not organized in that same way around using the money. And so I think the first reach would be out to Tony to say, hey, do you know who in my community, if you don't already know, is the best point of contact for this funding? Because there's going to be a point of contact, and then making that connection. I'll tell you, it is, all I could think about with the money is I've got to get access to this because there's such a connection with our work and substance use disorder. And I was watching all of this money go to the CSBs. And I was like, wait a minute, they can't be the only ones helping to solve this issue. We've got space here. And it might not be Kinship Navigator for everybody. That was just what my department was experiencing as a huge and really obvious connection. But there might be other ways to do connection. I mean, I know that we're having conversations right now about substance exposed newborns, and connecting the families, the pregnant and parenting women who have substance use disorder. And we're talking about how do we navigate better conversations with OBGYNs and hospitals about intentionally connecting these pregnant women in particular with the CSBs before they deliver. How are we getting to those women before they have babies and before the phone call comes to CPS? And the connection that's best is to the substance use treatment services. And so there's discussion about putting in a proposal to get nurses hired to work for the CSB to help navigate that space, with the idea that that is an early intervention and treatment service that is going to reduce the impacts on the child welfare system and the treatment community for years and years to come. And so we have a role in that we're in the conversation and talking about the experience we have as a result of those things, and talking about how we can collaborate with those nurses if the family is only coming to our attention after that substance exposed infant has been born. So there's lots of really cool opportunities. I think we just have to talk about what other jurisdictions and localities are doing to see what works best in our particular community.
So Gretchen, the questions are starting to pour in. I'll try to hit a couple of them really quick. Are there any localities using OAA money for peer support services? The short answer to that is absolutely. That's sort of a best practice across the continuum. And so yes to that. Is OAA funding possible for DSS agencies in terms of CPS cases involving substance exposed infants? We have to obviously need to talk about the details, but the answer is yes. In fact, preventing or dealing with neonatal absence syndrome is one of our key deliverable things that we work on. There's a question about the state. State DSS is working on its pilot Navigator program using OAA money to become more of an evidence-based model using the Washington State model. Would there be a need to use this program for OAA-funded KINNAP positions and programs? I think we're flexible. We like to see everything line up the way it should between the state and the localities. But if there's some nuances or differences, then you're not going to necessarily be excluded from applying for OAA funding. One other question, this is probably one for Gretchen, is how does your KINNAP position document their work? Since they're not a state-funded employee, do they not have access to OASIS?
No, they're in OASIS. They're hired as a family service specialist, and they're in OASIS.
And someone had their hand raised. I was getting to that next, and looks like the hand has been lowered. So we may have answered that question. Great. I don't see any other questions. If anybody had a question or a comment, please raise your hand if I failed to read your question. Gretchen, there's a lot of compliments in here. So
they're friends. They're friends, Tony.
Yeah, it's a friendly group. Hopefully this has been as helpful for all of you as it has been for me, even though Gretchen and I have been talking about this for a while. Each time she gets into the details, I learn more about it. You can tell that the passion is there, and that makes such a difference in public service. And so kudos to Gretchen and the team at Henrico. Thanks to everybody who attended for your time. Again, check back to our website in the next several days. We'll have all of this posted under voaa.us. Click on Abatement Academy and you'll see the links and the recordings. With that, we will wrap it up. Thank you again, Gretchen, and to all of our attendees for being part of the Abatement Academy.
Have a great day, everybody.